So we're going to be um, talking about a show that's on at the Drawing Center down in Soho. Um, in the medium of life, the drawings of Beauford Delaney. Um, and I actually have done a partial talk on his work in the past, but this is a that was a show that was on at Rosenfeld Gallery that actually has a lot of his work. But this is a much larger show at the Drawing Center. It really is the first large scale exhibition of his work in about 30 years in New York. Um, there actually was one at the Drawing Center, no, at the um, where was it? It was at the Studio Museum in Harlem back in 1978, but that's quite a while ago. He was still alive at that time. So he um, his dates are 1901 to 1979. Um, and the show that's on really is about his works on paper, but there's also canvases mixed into it too. It's really experimental work, incessantly working mainly between portraits and abstraction with some kind of cubistic cityscapes and landscapes mixed in. But the show features about 90 pieces altogether. Um, he was, as you can see from this set of self-portraits, he was unflinching in his approach to himself. Um, and as expressive and and disturbing in certain ways, it's also really there's a sense of humor in there too. Um, the the one thing that I would say is the distance between the the work that he did, the abstract work that he did when he was in France, is very different from the abstraction that he was starting into in the United States. But we'll get into all this. Um, so born in 1901, a gay black man from the Jim Crow South, he struggled bouts of mental illness, poverty, but managed to keep pushing forward as an artist. He didn't hide his troubled soul, as you can see in many of these self portraits. Um, but uh, he did have a struggle, a lifelong struggle with mental illness, but also coming to grips with his sexuality um, in a time that was not very forgiving. Um, so we're going to move on to this. Uh, his father was a Baptist minister. He was the eighth of 10 children in the family, and only four of those children made it to adulthood. Um, this self-portrait that I've got over to the right, if you look at those eyes and then you look over at the photograph, the second child in from the right is Beauford, and look at those eyes. I mean, even as a little guy like that, you see those kind of troubled eyes. Um, he and his brother were encouraged to draw, and um, basically they took classes. They grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. So his father toured, so they would go out with the father when he was doing services out in the countryside. Uh, okay, so um, Lloyd Branson was a um, a fairly well-known painter in Knoxville. That's not saying a lot, but he was a fairly well-known painter, and did these kind of countryside um, scenes, and did a bunch of stuff that was about the Confederacy and stuff like that. He actually saw some of Buford's drawings, and actually hired him to work in his studio, and in fact was very supportive of Buford. Um, and he worked there basically from when he was about, I think he was about 16 when he started to work for him. In 1919, Beaufort was deeply affected by the 1919 Knoxville race riots, which were also known as the Red Summer Riots, which occurred when he was a teenager. The riots, which saw white mobs attacking black citizens and businesses, left a lasting trauma on Delaney. He basically wanted to get out of there. And in actuality, Lloyd Brenson helped him. He believed in him enough, even with his kind of mixed background, believed in him enough to actually help him financially to get up to Boston to study, which is what Beaufort did. Um, and basically, he studied in Boston for about 3 years, I believe it was. Um, he landed up there. Yeah, he moved to Boston in 23. And with the financial assistance of Branson, um, he trained in Boston, and actually found a boarding house that kind of immersed him in Boston's high society political and social economic sphere. So it was a very different experience for him. So in 1929, um, he felt that he had gotten about as much as he could out of being in Boston and moved to New York. Um, and what you see in the lower right hand corner is a picture of Beauford and Charles Alston, who was one of the leading um, artists in the Harlem Renaissance. He did murals, and in 1929 he was on the WPA, so he actually hired Beauford to work with him. All right, wait a minute. Sorry, get a little bit. All right. Um, the picture in the middle is a photograph that was taken by one of his sisters. I believe he was maybe 18 or 19 years old when she took that shot. Um, on the lower left, you see a 1946 painting by Beauford, um, and it it actually is kind of typical of that period of time. But let's see. Okay, here we have um, a drawing of Joseph Delaney, who was, um, excuse me, Delaney. Um, Joseph was his brother, was also an artist, and you see two of his pieces on this page. Those are Joseph's pieces. The charcoal drawing is by Beaufort. And at that point in 1933, Beaufort won a prize at the Whitney Studio Galleries, and that was actually the precursor to the Whitney Museum. And he was hired by the person who was the director at that time to work in the museum, and gave him a studio living space. And here we are. He was featured in a Life magazine article that ran a major story about Black Americans that included a segment about artists. A photo of Beaufort seated in front of his portraits in Washington Square Park was featured, and the write-up described him as one of the most talented Negro painters. Beaufort was ecstatic. So the pastel in the center is, kind of a typical piece that he was doing at that time. He was working out on the streets and doing doing portraits. Now, in the lower right is a young James Baldwin, and James Baldwin, as you know, is a great writer and spokesperson, advocate, and he came knocking at the door of of Delaney's studio, and they became fast friends. And this is a portrait um, that he did of Baldwin at I guess it was about 18 when they first met. Now, Delaney was 36 or 38, something like that. Um, they did have a liaison, and actually their friendship lasted um, throughout both of their lives, really. Um, so by the 40s, he was beginning to explore this much more expressionistic approach. Um, Baldwin learned much from the older artist about what a lifetime commitment to creating art meant. But I'll talk more about this kind of shifting bond between them as we get a little further with the talk. Ah, so Beauford's friendship with other artists like Stuart Davis, whose work you see on the right, and Willem de Kooning and a number of other um, uh, actually George O'Keeffe was a good friend. Um, so you can see he had long conversations with Stu Davis, and you can see in the traffic signals piece in 1945 the influence of those broad, flat planes and that kind of cubistic breakup of space. Um, I can't say as this is a totally mature piece on the part of Beauford. We're going to go a lot further into some beautiful color work that he does when he gets to Europe. But for now, this is a self-portrait from 1944. Um, and it really kind of shows that kind of disturbed aspect of how he saw himself. Now, he got along with other people really well. I mean, people really loved to be around him. They found him to be very energetic and lively. Um, Other artists really appreciated him. Uh, and again, George O'Keeffe did this wonderful portrait of Beaufort. Uh, the jazz component as inspiration would be an ongoing theme for Beaufort. I mean, basically, these pieces kind of combine that kind of cubistic business that goes on with Stu Davis with a kind of jaunty, sort of primitive um, approach to figuration. Now, it wasn't that he didn't know how to draw. He really was. There were a number of black artists who were kind of using folk art um, a matrix to work out of. Uh, so interesting work. Funny, playful. Okay, and now basically um, he won. This is on the lower left is Yaddo from 1950. This is a greenhouse at Yaddo, and Yaddo is a an artist retreat in upstate New York. It's up near Saratoga, and he won this residency for 2 months, um, 1950. At that point, actually, by this point, um, Baldwin had moved to Paris in 1948 and was writing to Beauford constantly saying, "You got to come over here. It's very different here. You don't have to deal with the kind of racism that you face every day there. Um, he should come over." And again, Henry Miller, who knew Beauford, really admired him, um, was also living in Paris and was writing to Beaufort telling him he had to come over. Uh, and Miller described Delaney as a great artist and friend through and through, not only in the medium of paint, but in the medium of life. Miller highlighted Delaney's unique ability to capture both the vibrant energy and inner struggles of his subjects. And this is a wonderful watercolor from 1967. So I'm hopping kind of out of sequence here, but I wanted to show you that beautiful piece. So, he could do these representational pieces. When he chooses not to, it's an expressive choice. Okay. And this is, he he actually had a very successful show um, in New York exhibiting his abstract pieces. And with that money, he hopped on a boat, and he was intending just to go over for a trip to Paris and ended up staying the rest of his life. So this is one of his first pieces that he did landing in Paris. I'm going to go back here. Baldwin did not know that Beaufort was coming, and he was in a cafe, which I guess that's what you do when you're in Paris. And he looked out the window, and across the street he saw Beaufort and just got up and ran out, and they embraced in the middle of a really busy street. And basically what happened was James Baldwin found him an apartment um, downstairs from where he was living in the same apartment building. Um, Now, Baldwin was traveling a lot at that point, so he would go away for periods of time and come back. Um, and on one of those trips, he came back in 1954 and found that Beaufort was really not doing well. He was having these inner voices that were very destructive and disparaging to him. Um, so he was having a really, really hard time at that point. And Baldwin found a cottage, a house outside Paris, and moved Beaufort there in 1956. And this really changed the nature of Beaufort's work. Um, looking out the window out into this beautiful garden, it really just opened up the you can see these two flowing watercolors that he did, during that period of time. That these were done, I believe, 1960 or 61, something like that. But there's a whole series, and the light and airiness of these pieces are very different from what he had been doing before this. And here are a couple more of those. And basically he would do these kind of monochromatic, this green on green, um, layering transparent watercolor and gouache, which is a much more opaque paint. And he would do these really beautiful, subtle gestural things. And you can just imagine, you know, that light pouring in the window of the studio and coming out in these paintings. Okay. It really had a profound effect on him. This being out of the urban setting freed his work to be more flowing and allow this abstraction. Um, Not that he stopped doing the representational work, but it was very different. And he actually kind of integrated the more abstract textural mark making into his representational work. And you see this lovely piece called Athens. Well, as it turns out, he was out there for a number of years and had a show in 1961 of these pieces in Paris. Here's an earlier piece from 1958. One of the things I wanted to show you in this is, let's see if I can pull up the, let's see. I'm trying to get to my, here we go. Let's see. All right. One of the things I wanted to point out in this painting is actually the kind of grid-like structure that he creates with the texture that's in the layers underneath the finished painting. And he would just keep adding these layers and layers of paint. And he probably mixed in some sand or some other stuff in with the painting, but you can see the kind of tactile quality that was in this. It's almost like, you could read this painting like Braille. And subtle, very subtle, nuanced stuff, not the harsh, expressionistic work that was going on in those portraits that happens in those figurative pieces, especially the self-portraits. But as I said, he had a show in the city, and it sold very well. Okay, and this piece on the right is Beauford's take on Chartres Cathedral, and on the left is, I mean, on the right is Monet's. And actually, I'm going to go back when Beauford was studying in Boston. There was a big Monet show, at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And that light, that that radiant light that glowed out of those paintings truly affected Beauford. He really loved that aspect of Monet's work. And so this is a quote from Beauford: "Sun, high summer, the brightness of Sunday morning sings with the earnest unison of deep felt songs by the devout congregation of the Methodist Church of John Samuel Delaney in Cleveland, Tennessee. The variety of color resplendent in the audience, from the color purple, black, eggplant to deep amber, even mother of pearl, all colors of the rainbow make the stained glass effect in the choral reality of splendor." So again, we've got this multi-sensory business going on. And he was captivated by the cathedrals of Notre Dame and Chartres, visiting both of them to bask in the exquisite tinted light that filtered through the stained glass windows. In 54, he lauded Chartres as the most wonderful thing I've ever seen, man created by man. So he painted this thing with these bright swirls of cobalt blue, yellow, and red, encircled by thick, stacked bands. He was fascinated with the spiritual power of the light embodied in the stained glass windows, deeply rooted in his upbringing as a preacher's son. So there was a kind of spirituality that came out in this, and this moment of synesthesia. The spirit became vividly tangible to him. Interesting stuff. So again, back to this business of jazz, and applying these crusty impastos to figurative work, um, integrating substance and rhythm. Okay, Charlie Parker, this abstraction. It's very, again, it's very substantial paint on there. And this wonderful jazz band piece where the negative spaces of the figures, these luminous figures in the middle of this yellow orange field, sunny music. Beauford portrays the saxophonist in regal attire. Bird holds a scepter adorned with the musical note as a feathered namesake observes from above. um, and, this looks nothing like Charlie Parker. We don't care. It's got nothing to do with that. It's really about the spirit. It's about that sense of what it meant to Beaufort to listen to that music. And here we have a portrait of Ella embedded in this beautiful abstract paint. And there's a little sketch from one of his many, many sketchbooks. I'm going to keep moving along here because there's so much to cover still. There's so much beauty in these abstract pieces. Okay, Beauford, um, from 1954, uh, on the fragment of a raincoat. And this reminded me of this kind of staccato stuff that Joan Mitchell was crooning out around the same time. Um, and she was in France and showing in Paris, so the overlap and exposure would have been there. A number of expats were in in Paris, of course, and there's a lot of these wonderful calligraphic gestural pieces. Um, they're kind of uh, exercise a kind of learning a language, and they translate into something like this, um, which was 1954, 56. He did not begin to paint gestural abstractions such as this until he moved to Paris. So, there were those impastos and abstract pieces that he was doing that were kind of cubistic, sort of Stu Davisy abstractions that he was doing in New York, but composition 16, he completed, started the year after he moved to Paris. And it probably meant that this was the 16th painting that he did in Paris. Using densely applied oil paint, ribbon like swirls of greens and reds and yellows, colors that would dominate his palette in both abstract and figurative works over the next 2 decades. Delaney realized his goal to remember the sculpture and structure of color. And he really, was squeezing out this stuff just straight out of the tube. You can see that he was squeezing it out, that those yellow squiggles and the reds and the blues were just straight out of the tube at this point toward the top layer, although there are these layers of things that are going underneath it, you know, that kind of merge into this cloud of transitioning color. So both these paintings appear to be yellow, and they are, but there are many layers to achieve that color. And the color underneath the surface makes that surface vibrate. He was mixing things in. He was mixing sand in with the gouache and pigment, dried pigment in the gouache painting. I'm not sure about the oil. Probably mixed in powdered pigment in with the oil also to build up the layers and textures. Oh, by the way, if you have any questions, just pipe them into the chat. Be more than happy to try and answer them. Okay. And again, you see how he's taking these abstract mark making, this buildup of sculptural oil paint to come back to the figurative. the representational, whoever this character is, beautiful mythological creature. Okay. Ah, and this is from 1961. I started to say that in 1961 he did a show in Paris, and it was very successful. Um, Many people turned out for it, and he did sell a lot. It got great reviews. Um, and with that money, he wanted to take a trip to Greece. And he set out um, basically um, giving money to people right and left, and coping with these voices in his head that were demeaning him and saying he was worthless, and that he shouldn't have all this money, he should just give it away. And so he's tormented by these voices in his head. He's on the ship that's headed for Greece, and he is so tormented by them, that by the voices, and they tell him to jump overboard, and he does it. And basically, he's fished out of the sea by some fishermen who happen to be nearby, and he's fortunately taken to a friend's home, and and in, I believe it was in Athens. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but they got him help, got him into a hospital for a period of time till he recovered enough. But with all that being said, these buoyant colors are still there. And he manages to find the this lovely spirit, even though, he may be coping with these crazy inner dialogues. He still manages to create these beautiful pieces of art. There's like a glowing presence in them. They really are, it's not easy to pull something like this off. And then, you know, bringing these buoyant colors right back to the figuration. Um, don't know who this character is, but he's quite a character. And here, the same colors, lovely touch, very sensitive. Anyone who's done watercolors, you you know how quickly it can turn into mud. To pull something like this off and have that radiance glowing from inside the painting is quite a feat. And again, these pieces, 1961, that blue sea brings up a slightly different um, um, notion, given the fact that we know he jumped in. Okay. Ah, and back to Baldwin and their relationship, and basically this changing roles from mentor mentee when Baldwin met and the shift from student to caretaker, basically. Um, but they really loved and admired each other, and it just really shows. I mean, the interesting part, one of the reasons why I put these up next to each other is kind of in 1941, Beaufort didn't know him. You know, the face is not formed. You know, he's an 18-year-old, um, beautiful, dark rapture. But by 1945, he really saw this man, and this portrait really has a very different presence and feel, um, much more identity. And here they are on the streets of Paris in 1960. And then this wonderful, crazy portrait of Baldwin, in the floating in this kind of abstract, confection. Okay. Other things going on in Paris at that time. Riopol, his work is very thick, very heavily encrusted, and this was 1953. It's stuff that I'm not saying that Beaufort copied him, because that wouldn't that wouldn't give you a painting like this piece on the left. Um, Again, it's gouache on paper, layers and layers of gouache and sand and pigment thrown on there to get to that rich tactile surface. Pretty amazing. Um, and then there's Sam Francis and his washy pieces that remind me a lot of those garden pieces by Beaufort. And and this untitled abstraction by Beaufort off to the right, and the one from Sam Francis. I mean, I don't think they were looking over their shoulders at each other, but they were tuning into a certain kind of minimal abstraction and textural qualities. Somebody had a question. Floating portrait of James Baldwin reminds me of Alice Neal. Yes, absolutely. Now, a lot of his portraits have that kind of, fierce, um, distorted kind of honesty, using that distortion to express the personality. And, looking at this again, a very, um, harsh, straightforward look at himself in the mirror. Now there were preparatory sketches for a lot of these that were, watercolors that he did. I don't have one for this one, but and this is a portrait of his mother. Now he only went back once to America after he moved to Paris in 1953. And it may have been in the mid 60s when he went back to see her, and went back to home in Knoxville. But he couldn't bear it. He just couldn't bear to be in the United States anymore. It's just a very different feel to be, for a black gay man, to be in a place that at least semi accepted him. Uh, Again, the texture. Whoop, okay. Um, here we go. Um, so this one, actually, the center portrait, there is a watercolor that I showed you right at the beginning of the talk that is kind of this the the preparatory painting for this. It it was his head was turned in the different direction. It's a three-quarter view the other way, but the cigarette was in the same place. But you can see the abstract painting in the background and the tactile quality, that um sculptural quality to the oil paint. And I've included these felt tip pen drawings. They're just so wonderful and wild. Um, in a certain way, kind of the one with the single foiled eye that goes into the other eye reminds me of Alexander Calder. Uh, it could almost be a wire sculpture. Uh, Now, he became more and more plagued by the voices, and at this point, James Baldwin had passed away from stomach cancer, 1967. Um, and Delaney Delaney was spending more time in and out of the hospital. The voices were becoming really powerful at that point, although he still had these lucid moments where he could paint. And this piece is an oil monoprint, really wacky, just wonderful piece. And this is in the show in New York. Not all the work that I've been showing you is in the show in New York City, but there's a good portion of pieces that are very worth seeing that are in there. A lot of the abstract color field pieces are there. So okay, the integration of the abstract mark making into the figuration they've really gelled together when you look at this crazy piece. Um, and this was Delaney's last known self-portrait. Um, the then 70-year-old Delaney portrays himself as a wide-eyed lithe youth, clad in African attire, not unlike that of a Maasai warrior. It is the only known self-portrait canvas that in which he presents himself full figure. And, I don't know what's going on in that background, the kind of eyeballs floating around back there, a little paranoid. And uh, so he was at that time. But this show, those beautiful watercolors and just incredibly expressive portraits and self-portraits are well worth the trip. The show is on till September 14th. Um, and the next talk that I'm going to do is on Ben Shawn, who is having a show at the Jewish Museum. So they're doing a survey of his work, and I think it might be a retrospective. I'm not 100% certain about that. On August 1st, we're having a concert. Jonathan Powell and Mambo Jazz They're a really, really great professional jazz group. It will be in the theater, and it's Friday, August 1st. So I'll mention it again because I am doing another talk before then, but okay. So if there's any questions, send them at me now. Otherwise, I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Have a good day.